Welcome to Cartoon Creators, where we talk to the minds behind the shows that raised us. I'm your host, Tamar Lilienthal, and today we're talking to Susan Kim. It is nearly impossible to sum up Susan's career in just one or two highlights, but let's give it a try. From Reading Rainbow to Pocoyo, Courage the Cowardly Dog to Are You Afraid of the Dark, Dragon Tales, Meow Kailan, and so much more. Susan's storytelling has touched every major children's series. We touch on a lot of important topics in the episode, including Susan's experiences as a diverse writer in the industry and her vision for a future where children's TV unifies our divided country. This episode is nothing short of inspirational. Let's take a listen. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm super excited to have you on.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. This is really great. I love talking about cartoons and the past, so it's all great.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I feel really fortunate to have you here. I mean, you've worked on so many really legendary shows. Uh, things like Blue's Clues, Arthur, Gullah Gullah Island. I mean, I think that there are probably few shows from my childhood that you didn't write on. So, um, Wonder Pets, I mean, Reading Rainbow, the list goes
Oh
on.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but with all of those incredible credits, could you talk a little bit about your early days, what your story is, what drew you to the work?
Oh wow. I think like so many people, I mean like so many kids, it's like I hate to reduce children to, stereotypes, but I was sort of the shy, skinny, imaginative kid who really loved stories and reading, and television was like drugs for me. I loved television so much at a really early age. And I especially loved cartoons. They were, to me, they were something just sort of souped up about the world of cartoons, humor and the adventure and the silliness and there was something that ever since I was really little, I remember, like, this is how old I am. Um, there was this show called The Flintstones that I was just like obsessed with. And it's funny. It's like as I got older, I realized that I actually, even when I prefer writing animation to live action for the most part. And
Hmm.
if I do animation, I really like doing, or even if it's live action, I like heightened stuff. I like genre stuff. When I write animation, I love writing stuff with animals or like sort of weird worlds because it's where you can really bend your reality. And I think I just found that really, really satisfying when I was little. And I think, I was probably like literally like 4 or 5, and I had two older brothers. And, we were this like, my parents were immigrants from Korea, and we lived in like in a 2-bedroom apartment. So I like shared a bedroom with my brothers for years, and we're just like always fighting and like just constantly like, fighting over the TV and just, but I remember one of my brothers told me that like cartoons were actually written, and the
Hmm.
idea that it was written like a, I understood that the idea that a book was written, but the idea that a cartoon was written just blew my mind. And the idea that you could get a job in television blew my mind because I thought this is so wonderful. Why would you even need to get paid for this? So from a really early age, I just loved cartoons. I loved stories. I loved humor. I loved movies. Just any kind of story being presented to me, I just thought was fantastic. So it just, for me, it's just been it was just a very natural evolution for me to go into it.
That's that's awesome. I mean, I think like when you know, you know. So
Yeah,
that's
it's sad in many ways because and sometimes you think, well, I think maybe I should, like I still really love animals, and I just like had a cup of hot chocolate with my cat. It's like I feel like in many ways I'm still like, like I never grew up. Like I spend all day like writing about talking chipmunks and playing with my cat, and it's like I'm a million years old, and it's in many ways I haven't grown up. So, which is either like really great or kind of sad. So
I mean, it sounds really great to me. But
well, then look in a mirror tomorrow because one day you may find yourself thinking, what have I done? Here I am.
That's too funny. That's too funny. Well, so I'm curious. As you've mentioned, you've been in the industry for a long time, and I can't even get through all the shows you've worked on, written on. I'll have to kind of attach them to some of our like publishing materials. But I imagine it's like asking you to pick a favorite kid, and I've asked a couple folks this question, but considering the amount of shows that you worked on, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
would you have a favorite?
Well, that's really interesting. It's like I was thinking about that because it's funny. It's like you pick jobs or you say yes to jobs for different reasons. And I remember like somebody said this about like in film work, you pick it because it's really good money, or you pick it because you love the creator, or you believe in the project, or it's gonna be it's gonna move your career. But there are like X number of reasons why you say yes to your job. And there's also X number of reasons why you love a job.
Mm,
So, like for example, I mean, Allegra's Window had really wonderful people. I loved the people in the writers' room. It was just we had the most lovely head writer, and I loved my fellow writers, and we were a real team. So that's But was it my favorite show? I don't know. Oswald the Octopus was just a trippy, weird, crazy world that Dan Yacarino created. So that was really charming to work on and really fun. I'm very proud of that. But I have to say, in terms of everything coming together for me, and it's like I definitely think it's like hands down my favorite show of all time was Are You Afraid of the Dark on
that's a great
Nickelodeon.
one.
Oh, I love. It's like first of all, the showrunners, Ned Kendall and DJ McHale, were fantastic. They were just so smart and so great and so fun. They were great. I loved that it was horror because, like, I love horror. It's always been just like this one of my favorite genres. Um, I love that it was shot film style, so that it was you could really like push yourself. At the same time, it was only half an hour, so structure was really important in terms of your act structure. But you could really it had to move. It had to be really active. And most of all, it's like I hate this is just not being a prima donna. I loved that it was an anthology show, so that even though it
Mm,
had a little wraparound at the beginning with the Midnight Society, every episode was like your story that you wanted to tell. And
right.
you weren't like, you didn't have to work with a regular cast of characters. You didn't have to set it all in the same school. You didn't have to like, you were really free. And so I wrote a bunch of episodes for them. And the only thing that made it hard was I didn't start writing until I guess maybe the third season. And they had already done so many stories that it was very hard pitching that show. But
Mm.
when you got something that they hadn't done before, it was so much fun working on that show. I love that, and they were shot so well, and they were just terrific. I had so much fun on that show.
That's awesome. And I think, it's so interesting to hear you talk about like how you gravitate towards these shows that are kind of different or weird, or like the world is like very unique.
Yeah.
So I know you also worked on Courage the Cowardly Dog, right? Like
Oh
that
my
had
God.
its that had its quirks for sure.
Oh, that was a
Uh,
crazy show. Yeah, that was nuts.
it's awesome though. It's awesome because I feel like, as much as um and kids TV is my life, and I love it, and and all of that, and yet like you can probably name a number of shows that are like pretty formulaic and resemblant of one another, and yet then you have these shows that either genre wise or kind of like world building wise or
Yeah,
storytelling wise are just different, and that
yeah,
makes total sense that that's what you gravitated to.
yeah, yeah. Because it's like Courage the Cowardly Dog was a really interesting show because it was created by this guy John Dilworth. John Dilworth is truly like he's like a mad genius. He's just like he's like nuts.
Yeah.
And I say that with tremendous respect. But he really has just this crazy world. He used to ride around his office on this giant tricycle wearing a fez. And like he had this big hookah in his office, and he'd sit there smoking his hookah with his fez on, and he was just nuts. And he's a real artist. He's like he just doodled and drew, and he had very strong ideas of what he wanted. And so he would give you like a concept. So like I remember like one I wrote, which was like about a scarecrow. Like Muriel saves this battered old scarecrow, and then it
Mm,
becomes very possessive of her and wants to sort of save her from the farmer. And like, so of course, Courage has to save her from this scary scarecrow. But the fun thing about that was I was just given like the germ, the idea of this scary scarecrow. And John really just sort of like, let's just come up with like, and knowing that he was so visual, I could really run with like really funny tropes about like what the scarecrow looked like, what the fields looked like, what it meant like for her to patch him back together. And he was very open to it. Every session, he really wanted you sort of like to really. It was great working with him because he really made you direct it on paper, which I hadn't really done that much of before that show, where you had to really like every shot. He really wanted you to storyboard it. And that was great because, like, years after that, I wrote graphic novels with my husband. And
mm,
it was so useful having like done this for years, just the idea of like what, like, and I find that like, even like when I'm teaching animation writers, like you got to think visually, like, what are we looking at? What are we looking at? And so that was just, and it was such a crazy world. So anyway,
yeah.
I'm totally digressing, but
No, no, no. It's funny that you say that. My only interactions with John Dilworth were that he came to speak over Zoom to my college class at one point at like the height of the pandemic. And it can be hard to really get a grasp on someone in a Zoom box. It was not hard to get a grasp on John Dilworth in a Zoom box. It was a pretty remarkable class, that's for sure. So
oh, I have to say,
incredible.
some of the most interesting people in kids TV, certainly, I'm talking about the 90s. It was the 90s was really different from today, and they had really strong personalities. And I'm not going to name names, but there was like I had tremendous respect for so many of these people creatively, but they had like really strong personalities,
Hmm,
and they had their own production companies, and they had a really specific way of working, and it was really tough. And I really loved working on Courage the Cowardly Dog, but it was tough, and I'm not gonna lie. It's like John was a real taskmaster, and
hmm.
I think he'd probably be proud to hear that. Like he'd say, "Yeah," like he had his standards, and a lot of people back then were just. And I think back then because the net, like Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, they were still pretty new back then, so they sort of let people
Right.
run with it. So it was you could just get away with much more um, out there behavior. And it's just like, and I think, and you could say, oh, today it's like missing so much of that crazy energy. Or you could say, well, no, maybe workers are a little bit more protected from like really exuberant bosses. But it was one cool thing about getting older in an industry is you really do see the shifts, and it's kind of cool to have lived through them. So,
Oh, for sure, for sure. I can imagine. And I think that that's actually a great segue to my next question, just in terms of seeing shifts and the industry back in the day not being what it is now. Um, it's actually very funny. So I interviewed Jill Causa Turner a couple days ago,
oh, yeah, chill.
and I
Known her like a
asked
trillion
Jill,
years.
yeah, so I asked her about kind of being a woman in the industry. And she said to me, yeah, it really was very different back then. And, I can really only think of one other woman who, I saw in rooms with me back then, and that was Susan Kim. And I said, well, that's so funny. I'm about to sit down with her too. But I think that's pretty telling. So I would love to hear from you, not just, about being a woman in the industry at the time, but an Asian American woman in the industry at the time. I mean, a lot of people don't necessarily expect that kids TV back in the day was, a man's world, a white man's world, but it,
Yeah.
it definitely was, and I'm curious what that was like for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it still is in many ways. Let me first of all frame this by, you know, I've been in kids TV for a super long time, and you work with people again and again, and a lot of them are your friends. And we're all human, right? So I don't mean this in a, we're all products of the times we live in, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, and I would say another thing about kids TV is, for the most part, I would say 95 times out of 100, I think the intentions are always really good. I think people really want to do the right thing. And I think they're trying to be, I think, the impulses are always good. So I don't, it's not, yes, it was hard, but at the same time, I can't just say, oh, it was just like, it wasn't a two-dimensional, like it was such a racist world and it was such a sexist world. Although, of course, there were elements of both. There was a lot of microaggression, but at the same time, I mean, growing up when I did, you know, I, I think, I think this is true for a lot of, certainly of my generation. You just like you were sort of taught to sort of like ignore the microaggression, because the main thing was just like doing the best you could, sticking to your career and rising in your, in your industry or whatever. So
Right.
my father was like really made that clear to me, like just basically brush that stuff off because you've just got to focus on what you want to do. So I would say that in terms of the what I was working on back then, there was the very little stuff that was done with Asian American content tended to be very I used to refer to it in my mind as sort of like a Frommer's travel guide. So it wasn't
Mm,
just like a travel, but it was not a hip travel book. It wasn't Lonely Planet. It wasn't, Time Out. It wasn't the Blue Guide. It was like Frommer's or Fodor's. It was like an old fashioned guidebook that your parents would have used, So it was like, so it
right.
had a very old fashioned, like, it was like a cultural tourism thing. I can't tell you the number of episodes I wrote about Lunar New Year or like a dragon parade. And like Koreans don't even do dragon parades. But I was the Asian. So like we're gonna do an episode on the dragon parade and on tea ceremonies. And it's like it was just like it was something that was to me very foreign to my experience. But I think it was well intentioned.
Right.
Um, and so a lot of times and overwhelmingly the showrunners were white, and again, very well intentioned. And they were trying their best to make it an authentic experience. So I was hired, and I'm really grateful for that. But I remember the first Reading Rainbow I wrote was based on a book called The Lotus Seed, which is actually a beautiful book. It's sort of the metaphor, like I don't know if you knew this. I didn't know this. A lotus seed is like you can keep a lotus seed like in your underwear drawer for like 60 years and then throw it in the mud and it'll germinate. It's like
Oh,
there's
wow.
astounding. They're astounding. So the whole book is sort of like it's a very beautiful metaphor for like, immigration and like bringing the old country, blah blah blah. So it was very beautiful. I'm glad I did it, but it was a little, it was not exactly my experience. But I then went on to write a bunch of other Reading Rainbows that were much less, that actually had nothing to do with Asian American identity.
Mm.
Um, I wrote several episodes of the Mystery Files of Shelby Woo. Again, white showrunner, creator. Again, it was like it was pretty, early on. It was and it was funny because my story editor was Suzanne Collins,
Oh.
who was like, it's amazing. I remember like years later, I was like, hey, Suzanne, you want to like take part in this Writers Guild thing? And she said, oh, I'm writing a book. And I was like, hey, good luck with that. So, but, but she was my story editor on Mystery Files of Shelby Woo. And again, that was slightly, I mean, it was mostly about the mystery, but there was stuff with her and her father or whatever, who was like a detective or something. So, and then later in the early 2000s, I guess, I worked on Ni Hao Kailan. Same thing. It was created by Asian American person, but the showrunner was white. I would say that the problem with that is that, and it's hard. I've like tried putting my finger on it because, um, you need to, it's a delicate balance because who you are obviously influences like your tastes and your sense of humor and your understanding of family. You know, um, my husband is Jewish and I grew up in a very Jewish suburb. There was
Oh,
a really distinct, I really grew up with a very strong sense of like Jewish humor, Jewish references, Jewish family, Jewish culture.
mm-hmm.
It was like, I really was raised in it. And again, my husband is Jewish and we've been together a really long time. So I would say, and for someone not Jewish to write Jewish characters, like my husband's very sensitive and we'll sort of like laugh about it. Like, this feels like so not Jewish. And
Right.
I know what he's, you know what I'm talking about. And I'd say the same thing is true. I have like friends who are black, friends who are Italian, friends who are Greek. It's like if you're not of that world, you're missing a little bit of nuance, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, very recently, I worked on a really charming show for Nickelodeon, and I know the showrunner is a friend of mine. He's a great guy. He's a really good writer, really funny, but he's not Korean, and his story editor is not Korean, and the characters are all Korean American. And
Mm,
I thought they did a lovely job. They were really fun, but it was like just a little off, and I can't put my finger on it. It had to do with the way people talk to each other, the way they talk to their parents, the sense of humor within the family. Just a few degrees off, and I really couldn't put my finger on it. And I mean, to be fair to Nickelodeon, they had approached me to work on the show, and I was not available. So
mm,
it's again, I think they were really trying to do their best. And again, the guy who ended up running it is a terrific writer. He's someone I respect enormously. But it's a nuanced thing. I think it's getting better. But
right.
I think another thing back then, and it's like I think I was able to push past it. I think there were so many assumptions when people see your Asian female face walking to a room. There are so many assumptions about your sense of humor,
Mm,
about your ability to write action, about your ability to write white characters, about your grasp of math and science, which, let me tell you, is really poor in my case. I really suck at math. I really suck at math and science. So, you get hired on shows by people thinking you're going to be humorless. You're going to not be able to write boys. You can't write action. You're really good at math and science. You're kind of a nerd. You're really filial. They have this whole melting pot of assumptions.
yeah.
And being told, the times I've been told, wow, your script is really funny, or like, oh my God, that action scene was fantastic, or I didn't know a girl wrote this. It's just,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
so it's like, again, this is like beyond, because I think certainly women, any woman walks into a situation and the idea of the number of women who've been told, wow, you're surprisingly funny. And it's like, well, yeah, kind of, that's kind of who I am. So,
Right, right, right.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can certainly relate to a lot of that. I think, we're now starting to see, I don't remember who I was talking to recently, but someone saying, about the importance of kind of both getting diverse voices into a room
Yeah.
and also recognizing that diverse people can also write more than just their like token cultural story,
Oh,
which I think
yeah.
is so valuable because you have that too, even like well-intentioned people who are like, oh, you know, you're Asian American, please write the Lunar New Year episode. Whereas it's like, I could
Yeah.
also write about cows.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
It's funny. Years ago, I worked on this series for HBO called Happily Ever After, which
mm.
was sort of culturally specific retellings of fairy tales.
Oh,
And I wrote two of them. I wrote, and they to their, I mean, it was again really, it absolutely the best of intentions. It was just um, I did Princess and the Pea, and I did Little Mermaid, and I did Korean American retellings, and Margaret Cho was one of them in one of them, and
Oh,
Daniel Day
wow.
Kim was in one of them. So they were cool. They tried to get the writer to be culturally specific, and they tried to get the voice talent to be culturally specific. So that was great. But I remember really interesting. And this is probably about 30 years, maybe 20, yeah, probably 30 years ago or so. I remember I was doing Princess and the Pea, and of course, it's a comedy, so it's just basically, oh, the prince, yeah, that the prince, they're trying to find the perfect prince, the perfect princess for the boy, and the pushy Korean mother just really wants the perfect girl. She has to be a real princess, right? Blah blah blah. So anyway, but the character of the prince, I remember my executive at HBO, whom I will not name because we are all people of our time. And that was 30 years ago. And I don't want things I said 30 years being quoted back to me because
No,
I'm
for
sure I
sure.
said
For sure.
horrible things. But at the time, she said, why don't you make him a real nerd? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, why don't you make him like he's a prince, but he's got a pocket protector and he's got glasses and he's got a really bad haircut. And I said,
Mm,
okay. I said, that's actually, and I was saying, this is your executive. And I was just a freelance writer. You have to be very diplomatic. But I said, that's actually kind of like, to me, that's kind of problematic. That's kind of a
yeah.
stereotype that I don't, that's kind of haunted my brothers their whole lives. And it's not a stereotype I want to put into something that's supposed to be lifting up diverse voices. And she said, Rick Moranis. She said, Rick Moranis. And I said, of course. And she said, he plays a nerd. He's really funny. And
Mm,
I said, that's true. And I said, how many other white actors can you name? And she said, what? And I said, probably hundreds, right? I said, how many Asian male actors can you name? And I said, representation, when it's so limited, is really important. I said, can you name any Korean American actors? And I said, this is going to be one Korean American character in the entire field of kids' TV. I
yeah.
don't want him to be a nerd. I really don't want him to be a nerd. And to be honest, she was really angry at me. And it was a
Huh.
fight. And it was not, but I just refused. I said, I cannot write that character as a nerd. I'm willing to walk from this project. And again, I don't, I think that woman was speaking from her time. And I
Right.
like to think
Right.
that she's probably, absorbed the memo by now. But at the time, I was like, oh, this is terrible. So,
That's an incredible story. That's yeah, yeah. Wow. I mean, it's yeah, look, it's a testament to how far we've come, though, there's still obviously more to do, but I think, honestly that might be kind of a really great ending point, though if we have time for one more else we could sneak in one more question as well, but
sure.
um you've been in this industry so long and have just written on so many really legendary shows that really shaped so many of our lives. Um, what
Oh,
types of stories do you still think need to be told? Like, is there any ground that in your mind we haven't covered in
oh
in kids
yes.
TV?
Absolutely, absolutely. First of all, like kids TV is really changing because of TikTok and YouTube. It's getting
Mm,
much shorter kids' attention span because every kid has a phone. So it's shifting. So it's the form has to change a little bit. That's number
right.
one. In terms of the types of shows, to do this, and we like it's like a lot of people call it hiding the broccoli. I think there's got to be a lot of hiding the broccoli stuff where you're making taking something that's kind of serious, but it needs to be told, and you need to do it with humor and silliness and funniness and like just I think some everything that has to do with civics is really important. The whole
Yeah.
notion of fair play and cooperation and collective action and like coming together and fairness and organizing and standing up and questioning authority. All the stuff, it's like that stuff. This world, our country is so splintered right now. It's really depressing. It's really depressing. These are really tough times. We have such tough issues to face as a nation, and we're
Yeah.
so divided, and we've got to come together, and you've got to give kids hope. You've got to like it's doable. We can do this, but you've got to model it, and you've got to do it with humor. You've got to you've got to. There's a lot of sort of blue state, red stateism in television. I think kids' TV is a little bit better, but there's still a little red state, blue stateism in kids'
Yeah.
TV. I
Yeah.
would love to find some common ground where we can actually start letting kids know that, you know what, you actually can cooperate, you actually can work together to solve problems. That's one. I'd say, ought to be honest, and this is something, it's going to be a really long time. I think there's so much room for more psychological nuance
Mm.
for kids. And again, doing it in a way that's safe, in a way that's funny, in a way that's makes kids, but that makes kids feel seen. A lot of kids have weird parenting, like atypical parenting, or they are struggling with issues of gender or identity or ability or disability or sizeism. They're dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a lot of stuff that our kids are going through right now. And to really nail that psychologically, that you are seen, you are capable of being a star and being hosting your own show, and like having it's like you're not just teaching kids who feel different that they are worthy of like being a protagonist. You are teaching kids who are not like them to realize, hey, those kids can be my friend. So I think there's a
Mm.
lot of nuance there, so that should be explored. And I also think this is sort of partly what I said about civics, but I think there's a lot that can be done with like sort of actionable like activism. Like, what can you do? What can
Yeah.
you do right now? How can you stay involved? Kid size stuff. Like, what can you do within your school? What can you do within your classroom? What can you do within your family? How can you help out your mom? How can you help out your kid brother who's a pain in the neck? What can you do that you actually have power? And I
Yeah.
think there's like stuff, and you can do this with like humor and imagination. So those are whole areas that I think kids TV is still very corporate, and it's very safe, and tends to be conservative. And I think there's tremendous stuff that can be done with all these areas.
I love that. I love that. And I think that that's really a perfect ending point. I think that, there's always more stories to tell. And I know that, as much as we talked about kind of earlier things, I love keeping up with, the shows that you're writing on now. Um, and not to make you feel old or anything, but like
Oh, I
some of
am
the
old.
folks from back in the 90s and 2000s likely are having, kids of their own who are watching what you're working on now. So um,
Yeah.
I know that I would love to see more of really everything you just described. So thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in to Cartoon Creators. We would love if you connected with us on one of our social media channels. Have a comment, question, or an idea for a guest we should bring on to the pod? Email us at info@cartooncreators.com. Both words starting with a K, of course.